Today, we uncover what happened to these fitness influencers that Sherpas knew were going to die. From an athlete who believed fitness could replace weeks of preparation on Everest, to a sport climber who unclipped for a single shot in the most dangerous terrain and within seconds was sliding toward something he couldn't see. It was April 14th, 2015. The South Col route on the Nepalese side of Everest sits at 26,000 feet, well into the death zone where human bodies begin to shut down. A climbing team was making final preparations at Camp 4 before their summit push, but one member had only arrived at base camp 8 days earlier. Brock Tenley was 31, a competitive CrossFit athlete from Colorado who ran a successful training facility. His approach centered on functional fitness and mental toughness, with a client base drawn to his high-intensity programming and competition results. Brock had decided to climb Everest to prove that CrossFit conditioning could translate to any physical challenge, including high-altitude mountaineering. He had no prior climbing experience above 10,000 feet. His plan was to reach the summit in 18 days total, from arrival in Nepal to standing on top, a timeline that ignored standard acclimatization protocols. The Everest climbing season operates within a narrow window in May, when jet stream winds temporarily shift away from the summit. Even during this period, temperatures at high camps regularly drop below -20 degrees Fahrenheit, and oxygen levels sit at roughly 1/3 of sea level. The human body requires weeks to produce additional red blood cells and adjust to reduced oxygen, a process that cannot be rushed regardless of fitness level. The lead Sherpa on Brock's team had expressed concern about the timeline from the first planning meeting, explaining that even strong climbers needed 6 to 8 weeks minimum, including travel, base camp arrival, and multiple acclimatization rotations, to attempt the summit safely. Brock had dismissed this as overcaution, pointing to his fitness metrics and recovery abilities. During the initial rotation to Camp 1 at 19,900 feet, Brock had developed a persistent cough and headache, but attributed it to normal altitude adjustment. The Sherpa team noted he was breathing harder than other clients at the same elevation and suggested adding an extra acclimatization rotation. Brock refused, saying he was on a tight schedule and felt strong. By the rotation to Camp 2 at 21,300 feet, his cough had worsened, and he was taking twice as long as other climbers to complete basic tasks. The Sherpas held a private discussion about whether to continue guiding him, but Brock insisted he just needed to push through. On summit day, as the team prepared to leave Camp 4 around midnight, Brock was already breathing rapidly at rest and had developed a wet, rattling cough. The team departed Camp 4 just before midnight, headlamps cutting through darkness as they began the slow climb toward the balcony at 27,500 feet. Brock fell behind within the first hour, stopping every few steps to catch his breath. By the early morning hours, at approximately 26,800 feet, Brock began coughing violently and couldn't stop. When he pulled his buff away from his face, his headlamp illuminated pink-tinged sputum in the snow. His Sherpa immediately recognized HAPE and told him they needed to descend. Brock shook his head and kept climbing, moving perhaps 10 feet before stopping again, bent over his ice axe. His breathing had become a loud, gurgling sound, audible over the wind. The Sherpa physically blocked his path and pointed downward, but Brock tried to push past him. He made it another 20 feet before collapsing to his knees. His Sherpa radioed the lead guide and began short roping Brock down toward Camp 4, but his legs kept buckling. The gurgling in his chest had become constant. They covered perhaps 200 vertical feet, over 40 minutes before Brock collapsed completely and could not be roused. 2 other Sherpas descended to assist. They attempted to drag Brock down using a rope system, but his body had gone limp and the terrain was too steep without additional help. A radio call went out for support, but the nearest team was hours away. Brock's breathing became increasingly labored, then irregular. As dawn light began to illuminate the mountain, he stopped breathing entirely. The Sherpas confirmed no pulse and marked the location. Brock's body was left in place due to the extreme difficulty of high-altitude recovery above 26,000 feet. A team returned 2 days later and confirmed the death, documenting the scene. The expedition doctor concluded that Brock had developed high-altitude pulmonary edema due to inadequate acclimatization, exacerbated by continued ascent. Despite clear warning signs, fluid accumulation in his lungs had prevented adequate oxygen exchange leading to hypoxia and cardiac arrest. The case was ruled as death by natural causes related to altitude sickness, with contributing factors of insufficient acclimatization, time, and failure to descend when symptoms appeared. It was January 22nd, 2017. The winter route up Denali in Alaska presented conditions far more severe than the standard summer climbing season, with temperatures regularly dropping below -40 degrees Fahrenheit and winds exceeding 100 miles per hour. Larry Bridger was 28, a competitive bodybuilder and powerlifter from Texas who maintained a body weight of 242 pounds at 6 feet 1 inch. Years of training had built the muscle mass that defined his competitive success and shaped his coaching business. Larry had organized the Denali winter climb as a fundraiser after his niece underwent treatment for a serious illness, pledging to raise $50,000 for pediatric care. He had some backpacking experience but had never climbed above 8,000 feet or operated in extreme cold weather conditions. He had trained by doing weighted stair climbs and cold exposure sessions in a cryotherapy chamber, but had not tested his body's caloric requirements during multi-day cold weather exertion. Denali's winter season, from November through March, is considered one of the most hostile climbing environments on Earth. The mountain sits at 63 degrees north latitude, resulting in only a few hours of twilight during January and temperatures that can reach -75 degrees Fahrenheit with wind chill. The human body can require over 6,000 calories per day in extreme cold during heavy exertion. A 242-pound muscular climber needs roughly 1,000 more calories daily than a lean 180-pound climber. When the body runs out of fuel, it breaks down muscle tissue and fat for energy while simultaneously losing its capacity to maintain core temperature. The expedition's lead guide had reviewed Larry's physical stats during planning and expressed concern about the caloric requirements. The guide calculated Larry would need to consume roughly 7,500 calories per day, nearly double what a smaller climber required. Larry had packed what he thought was adequate food, but the guide noted it would likely fall short by day 5 or 6. Larry added some extra ration bars but didn't fully grasp the severity of the math. During the approach to base camp at 7,200 feet, Larry was eating his planned portions, but began feeling unusually tired by evening. The temperature was -15 degrees Fahrenheit, relatively mild for Denali winter, but Larry was shivering inside his sleeping bag despite wearing all his layers. The guide checked on him and found he was cold to the touch. They discussed turning back, but Larry insisted he just needed to eat more and adjust. At Camp 2 at 11,000 feet, after 3 days of climbing, Larry had gone through most of his food supply, despite being less than halfway through the planned route. He had been eating constantly, but couldn't keep up with his body's demands. The temperature had dropped to -35 degrees Fahrenheit, and Larry was shivering uncontrollably, even during active climbing. His guide made the decision to descend the next morning, but Larry asked for one more day, not wanting to abandon the fundraising goal. That night at Camp 2, the temperature dropped to -42 degrees Fahrenheit, with sustained winds creating a wind chill near -80 degrees Fahrenheit. Larry was inside his four-season tent in a sleeping bag rated to -40 degrees Fahrenheit, wearing his down parka, insulated pants, hat, and gloves. Late that night, his tent mate woke to find Larry shivering so violently the entire tent was shaking. Larry's speech was slurred, and he couldn't seem to understand questions. His tent mate immediately alerted the guide, who assessed the situation. Larry's core temperature was 93.2 degrees Fahrenheit, indicating mild to moderate hypothermia. The guide began active rewarming protocols, placing chemical heat packs against Larry's torso, armpits, and groin, and tried to get him to drink warm liquids. Larry could barely swallow. For emergency evacuation, no aircraft could fly in current wind conditions. Earliest possible rescue would be the following afternoon if weather improved. The guide and 2 other team members moved into Larry's tent to provide body heat. Larry's core temperature continued to drop. His shivering had stopped completely, and his pulse was weak and irregular, dropping below 40 beats per minute. Larry became unresponsive in the early morning hours. His breathing grew shallow and irregular, then stopped. The guide performed CPR for 30 minutes, but could not restore pulse or breathing. Weather conditions prevented evacuation until January the 24th, when a helicopter recovered Larry's body. The cause of death was determined to be severe hypothermia, resulting from insufficient caloric intake to sustain core body temperature during extreme cold weather exertion. The fundraising campaign had reached $31,000 at the time of his death. It was September 8, 2016. The Matterhorn's Hernley Ridge route on the Swiss-Italian border is considered one of the most dangerous climbs in the Alps, not because of technical difficulty, but because of the loose rock, exposure, and the number of inexperienced climbers who underestimate it. Emmett Finch was 34, an ultra-marathon runner from Oregon who had built a following by completing 100-mile races in extreme environments. 6 months earlier, he had been disqualified from a major desert race for cutting a section of the course, a mistake he claimed was due to poor marking, but which had damaged his reputation in the running community. Emmett had decided to climb the Matterhorn as a way to rebuild his image, planning to complete the ascent and descent in a fast, documented attempt. He had hired a guide service, but made it clear he wanted to move quickly and wasn't interested in the standard cautious pace. He had no mountaineering experience and had never used crampons or climbed on rock requiring hands for balance. He believed his endurance and leg strength would translate directly to mountain climbing. The Matterhorn rises 14,692 feet above sea level, with the Hernley Ridge route covering roughly 4,000 feet of vertical gain over exposed rock. The rock is loose in many sections, with holds that can break away without warning. Most guided parties take 7 to 9 hours round trip, moving deliberately and testing holds before weighting them. Afternoon warming causes increased rockfall as ice melts. Exhaustion leads to sloppy foot placement and taking risks that a rested climber would avoid. Emmett's guide had explained during the pre-climb briefing that the Matterhorn required patience and precise movement, not speed. The guide emphasized that they would move as a rope team and that Emmett needed to wait for instructions before proceeding through technical sections. Emmett nodded, but seemed impatient. They departed the Hernley hut before dawn, as is standard practice, and within the first hour, Emmett was pulling on the rope, trying to move faster than the guide's pace. The guide stopped and reminded him that rushing led to mistakes, and that mistakes on this mountain were often fatal. Emmett slowed briefly, but soon resumed pushing the pace. By mid-morning, at around 13,500 feet, they had passed several other guided parties, with Emmett scrambling quickly over rock sections without carefully testing holds. The guide noticed his movements were becoming less controlled. At the Solvay Hut emergency shelter at 13,120 feet, the guide called for a break and told Emmett directly that his pace was dangerous. Emmett argued they were making great time. The guide explained that descent was where most accidents occurred. Emmett reluctantly agreed to be more careful but was visibly frustrated. They reached the summit around late morning. Emmett spent several minutes taking photos and recording video, talking about redemption and proving himself. The guide then insisted they begin descending immediately to avoid afternoon rockfall and deteriorating conditions. Within 20 minutes of descending, the guide noticed Emmett's foot placement becoming sloppy, his boots skidding on holds instead of being placed deliberately. The guide stopped and reminded him to slow down. Emmett acknowledged this but continued moving quickly, clearly fatigued from the rapid ascent. At approximately 13,600 feet, on a section of exposed ridge with a steep drop on the north face, Emmett was down climbing a rock step. The guide was below him, calling out foot placements. Emmett reached his left foot down to a small ledge, but instead of weighting it gradually, he committed his full weight immediately. The hold crumbled beneath him and his boots skated off. His right foot lost contact simultaneously and he fell backward. The guide attempted to arrest the fall with the rope, but Emmett's momentum was too great and the anchor insufficient time to set. He tumbled backward down the rock face, bounced off a rock outcrop roughly 30 feet below, then continued sliding and tumbling down the steep north face. The guide secured himself and radioed for emergency response. He could see Emmett's body approximately 200 feet further down, motionless on a steep slope. A helicopter rescue team arrived within the hour and extracted the body. A physician confirmed death from the fall. The examination revealed massive head trauma, multiple fractured vertebrae, shattered ribs, internal injuries, and compound fractures to both legs and his left arm. The cause of death was traumatic injuries sustained in a fall of approximately 230 feet. The case was ruled accidental death due to a climbing fall, with contributing factors of exhaustion, excessive speed, and inadequate technical experience. The guide noted that Emmett's endurance had allowed him to climb faster than his skill level could safely manage, and that fatigue had degraded his judgment and movement quality to a fatal degree. Subscribe, because next episode We're covering the stories Sherpas quietly share among themselves, but rarely talk about publicly. You won't want to miss it. It was February 3rd, 2016. Mount Rainier in Washington State becomes a proving ground for winter mountaineering skills, with temperatures on the upper mountain regularly dropping below -20 degrees Fahrenheit and winds creating dangerous wind chill conditions. Tegan Quinn was 32, a triathlon coach and competitive open water swimmer from Seattle, who was known for cold water endurance. She regularly swam in Puget Sound year-round, including winter sessions in 45-degree Fahrenheit water, and had completed ice-mile swims in controlled conditions. Tegan had decided to climb Rainier in winter to prove that cold adaptation was transferable across environments. She had been writing articles about cross-training in extreme conditions and wanted to demonstrate that her cold water conditioning would translate to high-altitude mountaineering. She had some summer hiking experience but had never climbed above 10,000 feet or operated in sustained sub-zero temperatures. Mount Rainier's summit sits at 14,411 feet, and winter conditions create an environment drastically different from cold water immersion. Air temperatures at high camps can reach -20 degrees Fahrenheit to -30 degrees Fahrenheit, with winds exceeding 50 miles per hour. Cold water immersion is typically time-limited, lasting minutes to perhaps an hour, and is followed by immediate rewarming. Cold air exposure at altitude is prolonged, lasting days, with no opportunity for full rewarming. Frostbite occurs when tissue freezes, typically affecting extremities first. Once frostbite progresses beyond superficial frost nip, manual dexterity disappears. During the pre-climb gear check, Tegan's guide noticed she was wearing thin compression-based layers and moisture-wicking athletic fabrics. The guide explained that extreme alpine conditions required different approaches and recommended thicker base layers. Tegan said she always wore compression layers for athletic performance. The guide pressed the issue, explaining that cold water and cold air were completely different environments. Tegan acknowledged this, but seemed confident, mentioning her ice swimming credentials. During the approach to high camp at 10,000 feet, temperatures were around 0 degrees Fahrenheit. When the team stopped for breaks, Tegan cooled rapidly and began shivering more than other climbers. She had removed her gloves several times to adjust gear. By the time they reached high camp, Tegan mentioned her fingers felt tingly. The guide examined her hands and saw early signs of frost nip. Tegan seemed unconcerned, saying she'd experienced similar sensations after cold water swims. The guide strongly suggested she descend rather than continue to the summit. Tegan insisted she wanted to continue. The summit team departed high camp around midnight, with temperatures near -20 degrees Fahrenheit and winds gusting to 35 miles per hour. Within the first couple hours, Tegan stopped several times to adjust her pack, removing her gloves each time. By the early morning hours, at approximately 12,500 feet, her pace had slowed noticeably. When the guide checked on her, she said her hands felt stiff and she was having trouble gripping her ice axe. The guide examined her hands and saw that several fingers had turned waxy white, a clear sign of frostbite. He told her they needed to descend immediately. As they turned around, Tegan struggled to manage her ice axe. Her fingers wouldn't bend properly. The guide clipped a tether from her harness to the axe. After descending for 20 minutes, Tegan mentioned that her feet were also becoming numb. At around 12,200 feet, on a moderately steep snow slope, Tegan's coordination failed. She stumbled and fell, then began sliding down the slope. Her frostbitten hands couldn't grip the ice axe to self-arrest. The guide dropped into a self-arrest position. The rope came tight and stopped her slide. He descended to her and found her conscious but struggling. She said she couldn't feel her hands or feet. The guide radioed for emergency assistance. Another guide climbed up to help, and they rigged a rope system to lower Tegan down. She was becoming increasingly lethargic. They reached a more moderate section, around 11,800 feet, and erected an emergency shelter. They tried to stabilize her core temperature, but her condition continued to deteriorate. Tegan lost consciousness in the hours before dawn. The guides continued warming protocols until the helicopter arrived shortly after sunrise, but Tegan remained unresponsive. She was evacuated immediately, but was pronounced dead during transport. The cause of death was determined to be severe hypothermia, with contributing factors of extensive frostbite to extremities. The physician's report noted that the frostbite had rendered her unable to assist in her own descent, and the loss of function had led to the fall and immobilization that accelerated hypothermia. Contributing factors included inadequate clothing for sustained extreme cold, repeated removal of gloves, and a fundamental misunderstanding of the differences between cold water immersion and prolonged cold air exposure at altitude. It was March 11, 2018. The Khumbu icefall on Mount Everest is a constantly shifting maze of ice blocks and crevasses that climbers must pass through to reach higher camps. A team was making a routine carry to Camp 1, but one member kept stopping to film athletic movements on the ice formations. Hollis Locke was 26, a sport climber and fitness content creator from Australia. His content focused on dynamic movement and strength on rock faces in visually striking outdoor settings, from coastal sea cliffs to desert canyon walls. Hollis had decided to climb Everest specifically to create content showing athletic movement at extreme altitude. He had no mountaineering or glacial experience and had hired a full-service guide company to handle all technical aspects of the climb. His plan was to film himself doing handstands, dynos, and other movements at various points on the mountain, particularly in the Khumbu icefall, where the dramatic ice formations would provide visual impact. The Khumbu icefall is a section of glacier that flows down a steep slope between roughly 17,600 and 19,900 feet elevation. The glacier moves several feet per day, causing the ice to fracture into massive seracs, towers, and blocks separated by deep crevasses. Climbers navigate the icefall using aluminum ladders lashed together to cross crevasses and ascend ice walls. The entire structure is unstable, with seracs collapsing without warning and crevasses opening or closing as the ice shifts. Most climbing teams move through the icefall in the early morning hours when slightly colder temperatures marginally reduce the risk of serac collapse, though the danger is never eliminated. The standard protocol is to move quickly and efficiently, minimizing time in the danger zone. During the pre-climb briefing at base camp, the lead Sherpa had explained that the Khumbu icefall was the most dangerous section of the entire climb and that speed and focus were essential. He specifically told Hollis that stopping for photos or videos would not be allowed in the icefall. Hollis agreed, but seemed disappointed. On the first rotation through the icefall a couple days earlier, Hollis had stopped twice to film short clips despite reminders to keep moving. The Sherpa had been firm that this could not continue. Hollis apologized and said he understood. On March 11th, the team departed base camp in the early morning hours to cross the icefall during the coldest part of the day. At approximately 18,600 feet, near a section where aluminum ladders were lashed together to cross a crevasse, Hollis unclipped his ascender from the fixed line and moved to the edge of the route. His Sherpa immediately called out to him to get back en route and clip back in. Hollis held up his camera and indicated he wanted just one quick shot. The Sherpa moved toward him, repeating that he needed to clip back in immediately. Hollis was standing several feet from the fixed line, setting up his camera on a small tripod. The Sherpa reached him and told him to pack up the camera and return to the route. Hollis nodded and reached for the camera, but then noticed a flat area on top of a nearby ice formation, perhaps 6 feet higher and 10 feet away. He pointed at it and said it would be a perfect spot to film a static hold sequence. The Sherpa said no, they were leaving now. The Sherpa realized what Hollis was thinking and stepped between him and the formation, telling him directly not to even consider it. Hollis stepped back as if complying, then suddenly moved laterally and jumped toward the ice formation, clearly intending to grab the top edge and pull himself up. His hands contacted the ice, but his weight caused a section of the edge to break away. Hollis fell backward onto the sloped ice surface and immediately began sliding toward a crevasse, roughly 15 feet away. The Sherpa lunged toward him, but Hollis was sliding too fast. He swung his ice axe in an attempt to self-arrest, but the smooth glacial ice gave no purchase, and he slid over the edge. The Sherpa reached the edge and looked down. He could see Hollis roughly 30 feet down, wedged to his shoulders between the narrowing ice walls, motionless. He radioed for rescue support and began setting up a rope system. 2 other Sherpas arrived within minutes and lowered one Sherpa into the crevasse. He found Hollis unresponsive, wedged to his shoulders, with blood on the ice behind his head. There was no pulse, no breathing. Hollis was dead. His body was recovered and evacuated by a helicopter to a medical facility. The physician determined the cause of death was severe head trauma from the fall, with a skull fracture consistent with striking an ice wall during the descent into the crevasse. Death would have been nearly instantaneous. His camera was recovered from the ice where he had set it up. It had not been recording at the time of the fall. Thanks for watching. If you like these stories, click here.